You're watching Newsfeed AM. Let's get into that discussion now and unpack the developments in Zimbabwe. And we are joined by Global Advisor and SADC Executive Director of Good Governance, Chris Maruleng, who is with me in studio this morning. Chris, thank you very much for making the time. So let's deal with the latest coming out of Zimbabwe, and that is that this election was extended by a day. Yep. This was not planned, but we understand that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission saying that, well, owing to delays in delivering the material to the polling stations, therefore we must extend by a day, and therefore that was authorized by President Mnangagwa. And then there are arrests. Let's start with the disorganization that appears to have happened here. How much time would you say the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has had to plan for this election?
It's really bizarre because the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission knew 5 years ago that they would have to plan for an election that had a 12-hour window, and that there were going to be 12,374 polling stations across Zimbabwe. But still, on the day, they were just unable to pull it off. But it's not surprising, Kholi. The last time I spoke to you, I actually described it as orchestrated chaos.
Right.
And I was very deliberate in my description of this because the way in which let's call it the restraints, the difficulties for the voters to cast their votes occurred in the urban areas seem to have been deliberately planned. And also in the rural areas, we saw something else playing out, which were aspects of intimidation on the day, because what basically happened is that we saw some ZANU-PF activists basically setting up what were described as exit polls, except that these exit polls weren't polling people as they left. They were taking IDs, names of people before they actually went to the polling station, really indicating to a lot of the people in the rural areas that they were being watched.
Chris, how difficult can it be to plan for an election with just over 6 million people who are eligible to vote? And again, I don't know whether I'm obsessed with this figure of just over 6 million eligible voters in Zimbabwe, because I asked the question the last time, where is the rest of Zimbabwe? And is there something to say around the 6 million eligible voters?
Yeah, there's a lot to say. Only an election is really a voter's roll. And the reason why you cite, the 6 million eligible voters is because we assume those are the people on the voters' roll. However, as we sit here today, many opposition candidates will tell you that they haven't had sight of it. Indeed, many ZANU-PF candidates would tell you that they haven't had sight of the voters' roll. When people were going to the polling stations, one of the difficulties in allowing people to vote is because they weren't present on the voters' roll, which is basically a list of the people who are eligible. Now, if you fail to have a clean voters' roll, it effectively challenges the overall credibility of an election. And that is why we would argue that the ZEC should have been obsessed with ensuring the credibility and the verifiability of this voters' roll. However, that work wasn't done. And when you look at that number of 6 million, as you say, it's quite surprising that such a few people are eligible in a country that has got a population of close to 20 million people. So it all seems rather contrived, rather strange. And the fact that so few people registered might also give you a sense of the fact that a lot of the people in Zimbabwe probably don't have trust in the system of elections anymore.
We're going to talk in a moment about why the arrests. Some 40 activists, we understand, are in police custody, and they may or may not have lawyers to represent them at this time. But before we get there, surely with so much controversy around the ZEC, who are the custodians of this election, who constitutes the ZEC? Is there something to be said about the individuals who are running this institution?
Well, when you look at the ZEC, one of the challenges about it is that a lot of the commissioners, a lot of the staff who are basically responsible for the management and execution of this election are not independent. And when we say independent, not independent from the governing party. Some of them are close relatives of senior officials in ZANU-PF. Some of them have actually worked directly in government and still have close affiliations with individuals in ZANU. So it really calls to question how we can believe anything that comes out from an institution that is so closely aligned and has demonstrated bias in favor of ZANU-PF. In essence, what we're saying, Xoli, is that when you look at the technical aspects of the election, when you look at the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission itself, its composition, when you look at the prelude to this election, the context of what was happening, the use of violence, conditions that were not free or fair, we can basically begin to see a picture being constructed jointly by the ZEC, the ZANU-PF government, to make the political playing field for these elections uneven, and therefore calling to question, again, the legitimacy of this electoral outcome.
Well, that's the discussion then that we are now going to have, which is the credibility of this poll. If activists are arrested, and part of what we're told is the reason for their arrest is that they were conducting their own monitoring of the election results as they trickle in. And apparently this is not allowed in Zimbabwe. What does that say about the integrity of this poll? There are police officers, or should we say security agencies, who are saying, do not declare this election, otherwise you're going to be in trouble. I'm looking at tweets right now where a ZANU-PF presser yesterday gave a briefing and they apparently declared a victory. So why is it that the opposition must not be allowed to declare victory, and yet ZANU-PF, which is the governing party of the day, is allowed to do so?
That's exactly the point. So these activists who were arrested are mainly from the Zimbabwe Electoral Support Network. They were engaged in a process known as PVT, which is parallel voter tabulation. This occurs everywhere in the world where opposition parties, civil society engage in tabulation of votes parallel to that of the Electoral Commission, wherever that might be. Now, the interesting thing about this, Xoli, is that, yes, maybe opposition should not ideally announce the outcome of elections, but they are allowed. They are allowed to collate in a parallel voting tabulation. This is acceptable norms. But also when you look at this parallel voting tabulation, the challenge with it, I think, for the Zimbabwean authorities is that there's a form called a V11 form, which is placed outside of a polling station, all the polling stations, which basically gives you outcomes, the number of people who voted. This is freely available, and this is supposed to engender greater transparency and accountability. What these activists who were arrested were doing is that they were collecting all of these outcomes from V11s and simply creating a parallel tabulation so that they can verify what comes out from the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission versus what they tabulated.
Let's wind it up. Sure. Chris Maruleng. So 2018, that's the year that President Mnangagwa assumed the authority, assumed the seat of power in Zimbabwe. That election was disputed, right? We are now in 2023. If there is another election dispute owing to these elections being called into question, what chance does Zimbabwe stand to rehabilitate its image in the eyes of investors who are saying, we stand ready to come and invest in your country, but if the democratic processes are going to be called into question, then maybe we may hold off. Does Zimbabwe get out of the poverty that people are mired in right now?
You know, Xoli, in 2017 in Zimbabwe there was a coup, which basically resulted in a strange situation when we look at the civil-military relations of Zimbabwe, but generally the politics of Zimbabwe. We saw a situation where, through a bloodless coup, the icon, President Robert Mugabe, was effectively kicked out of power. and replaced by the military with a figurehead in the form of his lieutenant, Emerson Mnangagwa. Now, I'm raising this because of your question. How can we expect democratic outcomes from an undemocratic process which saw an unconstitutional change of power, seeing the military now dominating ZANU-PF? How can we expect that? The failure of the region to address this issue, this coup and that unconstitutional change of power, has resulted in the situation that we're in today. So what we're basically saying, Xoli, is that reforms cannot occur, especially democratic reforms, cannot occur from undemocratic structures. The argument that I'm simply making here is that ZANU-PF will not reform itself out of power to create better socioeconomic conditions for the majority of Zimbabweans. What we've seen them really obsessed with is creating a situation where, in terms of who gets what, when and how, which is governance, ZANU-PF acts in very self-serving ways. They act to ensure that their personal wealth, that of their families, that of their close associates, is increased, not the people of Zimbabwe. So, directly answering your question, Xoli, no, the economic situation will not improve. The investment conditions in Zimbabwe do not exist for secure investment, where investors have comfort that their investments are secured against the kind of abstract decisions that this government has a tendency to make.
I've got to ask the question, as I let you go, I've got to ask the question around the election observers. And we're talking the AU mission that is there. My understanding is that it is led by the former Nigerian President, Goodluck Jonathan. There should be SADC observers there as well, a mission. I'm raising these two bodies simply based on what someone said, and that is that at least half of the SADC problems, if Zimbabwe were to produce a legitimate election process, at least those problems may possibly be solved, because when there's a dispute in that country, we see a flurry of people leaving their homes. Zimbabweans who are in South Africa may not necessarily want to be here, but it's because of the conditions back home. And so what responsibility must these bodies, SADC and the AU, take if an election in Zimbabwe is declared, but we are told later on that it was not a credible election?
In actual fact, if you look at SADC itself, there is a protocol governing the conduct of free and fair elections, which stipulates what conditions must be in place before an election, which stipulates the technical components that would determine a free and fair outcome. If only the Zimbabwean authorities, and I think the region itself, could hold Zimbabwe and the ZEC accountable for the implementation of this protocol, we wouldn't be having these problems. The African Union also has very definite and clearly stipulated principles that would determine a free and fair outcome. The problem is that they all pay lip service to these protocols, to these articles that determine democratic outcomes. So what we are saying, Xoli, is that we are calling on our leaders in SADC to finally stand up and to say to the Zimbabwean authorities that this is not good enough. That when Zimbabwe is unwell, for example, I like to say when Zimbabwe sneezes, the whole region catches a cold. We all suffer from the problems that emanate from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a critical component of the Southern African region. Before this current situation, Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket, not just of Southern Africa, but of Africa. Now we are in a situation where the people of Zimbabwe vote with their feet. They come to South Africa. They come to other parts of the region. We must call upon our leaders, even here in South Africa, for them to finally stand up against ZANU-PF and say, this is simply not good enough.
Chris Morileng, let me thank you very much for your time and inputs